Good day. Last 24 hours have been relatively quiet days in the Ukrainian war, and perhaps that gives us an opportunity to take a step back and give some thought to where we are in this particular war as Ukraine's offensive grinds on, or perhaps I should say more accurately begins to ebb away. But anyway, before I do that, a very few words about the latest situation on the battlefronts. It looks as if fighting around Rabotino and Vervovoye on the southern lines has come to an end, at least for the time being, at least over the last couple of hours. Ukraine having failed to capture or consolidate control of either of these two villages. The Russians remain in full control of Verbovoye. Ukraine apparently still controls some houses in the northern part of Rabotino, but overall it's failed to capture the village as a whole. Elsewhere, few reports from Marinka and Avdiivka, two small towns, or perhaps more properly speaking, suburbs of Donetsk city, where there's been intense fighting at various times, which have taken a secondary place in terms of the war, since Ukraine began its offensive in June. The Russians appear to hold the initiative in both of these places. There's been reports today that the Russian army has finally entered Sinkovka. This village close to Kupiansk. In fact, in the event that Sinkovka is finally occupied by the Russian army, then one can speak about a Russian attack on Kupiansk as being only a few days away, or perhaps even a few hours away. But I have to say there's been reports previously that the Russians have occupied Sinkovka, and those reports were premature when they appeared. And though this latest report seems a little bit more reliable, I'm not going to say that Sinkovka has indeed been occupied by the Russian army until the Russian Defense Ministry confirms that. But anyway, it's probably true that the Russians, who have been playing a waiting game with the Ukrainians, moving more and more troops towards Kupiansk, building up their forces on Ukraine's northern borders, developing large units close to Kharkiv region, perhaps grooming General Surovikin to take command of these troops. There's been that rumor. Anyway, it seems to me that the Russians have been playing with the Ukrainians a waiting game, letting the Ukrainians exhaust themselves, as Colonel Richard Kemp said yesterday in that article I discussed in the Daily Telegraph, letting the Ukrainians exhaust themselves in attacks along the Surovikin line, or at least in the area of control north of the Surovikin line, an area where, by the way, according to many reports now, including an interesting one by Boris Rozhin, otherwise known as Colonel Kassad, where the Ukrainians have committed their last strong reserves. Anyway, the Russians appear to have been letting the Ukrainians exhaust themselves in this offensive in the south, even as they build up their army in the north, creep ever closer to Kupiansk, and perhaps prepare for some big offensive there, one which perhaps will provide the knockout blow to Ukraine, at any rate east of the Dnieper River. So that, it seems to me, is overall the state of the war. And of course, it's interesting to see how a couple of days ago, about a week ago, the American and British media were busy talking up a breakthrough that Ukraine supposedly had achieved, that supposedly captured Rabotino, that supposedly pierced the Surovikin line. We were hearing about how geolocation had confirmed that the Ukrainian troops were somewhere within the belt of defences of the Surovikin line near Verbovoye. I've discussed all of those claims in multiple programs. I've said that they were far from the truth, and gradually, over the last couple of days, all those claims of Ukrainian breakthroughs, of advances through the Surovikin line, have melted away. In fact, when we go back and look at where the fighting has been going on over the last, say, 2 weeks, what we find is that the same places are mentioned that we were hearing about right at the start of the offensive in June. Rabotino, Piatichatki, Verbovoye, Novodonets, Staromayorsk, Orozhanie, Klesheyevka, near Bakhmut. These little villages, all of them deserted, by the way. The civilian inhabitants were evacuated from them long ago. The Russians took steps to evacuate all civilians from these villages a few weeks before Ukraine began its offensive. Anyway, all of these small, deserted villages on the steppe lands and close to Bakhmut. Well, in the case of Klesheyevka, I've been hearing about that place for many months, since before Bakhmut itself fell, and the Russians captured it. The Wagner Group captured it in May. And of course, there's been Ukrainian attempts to capture Klesheyevka ever since then. And there were reports yesterday that the Ukrainians were in control of 80% of it, and then more reports a little later on that the Russians had launched counterattacks and driven the Ukrainians out again. But anyway, unending battles for Klesheyevka, unending battles for all these other villages. Rabotino itself, on the southern front lines, attacked for the first time, as I remember, on the 7th of June, Novodonets on the 4th of June. All of these places, as I said, on the front lines, in the zone of control, north or west of the heavy fortified barriers of the Surovikin line, and Ukraine still trying to consolidate control of all of these places. The only village which we hear more about now than we used to hear about earlier is Verbovoye, because Ukraine attempted to advance towards the Surovikin line by sidestepping Rabotino and advancing through the open fields to the east and south of Rabotino, and that inevitably obliged the Ukrainians to launch attacks towards Verbovoye, which, however, they have failed to capture. So, Ukraine continuing to fight for these villages, these small places, far from any important population centres, even deserted population centres like Bakhmut now is. Ukraine unable to capture or consolidate control of these villages. And to reiterate again, a point made by an anonymous commentator on a thread to an article in Slavyangrad, who made what I thought was an extremely astute point some weeks ago. So long as Ukraine is still fighting for control of these small villages, one cannot do otherwise than say that its offensive is making no progress at all and is in fact failing. And I noticed, incidentally, that Boris Rozhin, otherwise known as Colonel Kassad, a man with straightforwardly Stalinist political views, but nonetheless an acute and insightful commentator about the fighting. And by the way, one of the most interesting reporters who've emerged out of the Ukrainian conflict, going all the way back to 2014. Anyway, Boris Rogin recently made the same point, and he made it specifically with Rabotino, that putting aside the question of whether Rabotino itself matters to the overall defense system that the Russians have created in the south and eastern battle lines, Ukraine's inability to capture Rabotino is a sign of the failure of its offensive. And for that reason, if for no other, it is in Russian interests to keep the Ukrainians fighting, going on fighting, and losing men and machines for this place. So, story overall is of a Ukrainian offensive at standstill. Now, Vladimir Putin, as I said previously in another video, and as we've discussed on the Duran, actually said that the Ukrainian offensive was not at standstill, it was failing, but of course a offensive which is at standstill is an offensive which is failing. And yet the extraordinary thing, the remarkable thing, is that Ukraine, under relentless pressure from its Western sponsors, is unable to stop its best advice, the best advice it's been given, advice it's been given by people like George Beebe and Jim Webb in that article that appeared in Time magazine a couple of weeks ago. The best advice, the wisest thing it could do, is to pull back, end this offensive, go on to the defense, try to conserve its forces, try to create, even though this would be a rushed and difficult thing to do, a fortified line similar to the one that the Russians have created, rather than go on with these attacks which are bleeding Ukraine and its army dry. And we've now had two haunting documentaries or programs from the BBC. Not, as I said, a pro-Russian or anti-Ukrainian news outlet by any conceivable stretch of the imagination. But a BBC journalist has travelled around Ukraine, he's seen the villages, he's seen the cemeteries, he's seen the spread of flags, Ukrainian flags in the cemeteries, showing the graves of Ukrainian soldiers who've been killed in the fighting. He says that Ukrainian losses have grown significantly over the course of this offensive, which is almost certainly true. He points out that even if you accept the US figures, that Ukraine has lost 70,000 men killed and 120,000 injured, that is a huge proportion of Ukraine's army, which is supposed to number in total around 500,000 men. And of course, there are others who put Ukraine's losses much higher than this, do so plausibly. And of course, it's perhaps worth remembering that the soldiers who are actually buried in those cemeteries in Ukraine can only be a proportion, perhaps the larger proportion, of Ukrainian soldiers who have been killed, because there are many, many pictures, harrowing, awful pictures, which show the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers abandoned on the battlefields, often, I have to say, in states of advanced decay, and deeply distressing pictures they are. And apparently there have been some surveys using mobile phone data trying to track down how many Ukrainian soldiers are missing in action. And some astonishing numbers have been produced, which I'm not going to comment about because I have no way either of confirming or refuting them. But anyway, nobody doubts enormous Ukrainian losses, enormous losses in machines. We've seen tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armoured vehicles, trucks, all kinds of things destroyed as well. Every day, the Russian missiles and drones strike across Ukraine, causing more damage. There was a major Russian, or at least there was a major alleged Russian attack, timed possibly for Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Staro-Konstantinov. A number of Ukrainian civilians were killed. I should say quickly that some Russian commentators are disputing whether this attack, which was made by an aircraft using a guided bomb, that whether this attack was actually an attack by a Russian jet. They suggest that it was a Ukrainian jet launching an American guided bomb, perhaps a mistake, though some, of course, have alleged that it was a false flag. As is always the case with all such incidents, I'm not able to give a judgment one way or the other. It demands an investigation which, of course, will never happen. But regardless of that, the fact is, more people killed, more damage done. Every day, the fabric of Ukraine deteriorates. It weakens further, and more attacks on Ukraine's Black Sea ports, more attacks on its industrial infrastructure, such of it as there is. A Ukraine which is in an appalling situation, filling with corpses, cemeteries bulging, damage being done, and an offensive that is stuck. And of course, if it is the case that the Russians are indeed in the process of taking control of Sinkovka, if indeed it is also the case that the Russians, having registered the fact that Ukraine has committed its last Western-trained reserve forces to the fighting far away in Zaporozhye region, having also noted as well the enormous damage that has been inflicted on the Ukrainian army, damage which even Western commentators now concede, if it is indeed the case that the Russians have decided to reactivate the offensive towards Kupiansk, if they go ahead and storm Kupiansk and capture at least the eastern part of Kupiansk, east of the Oskol river line, if the Russians then start to move more forces into Kharkiv region and northern Ukraine, then it's easy to see how a stalled offensive, a failed offensive, could easily become a general operational crisis, absorbing the entire battle throughout Ukraine, with Ukraine short of men and machines in the face of a Russian military that is becoming increasingly powerful. And as I was preparing for this program, I read a long interview by Michael Vlachos, given by Michael Vlachos, an American analyst, and lecturer and scholar of war. He did it some months ago, a very interesting discussion program with Colonel Douglas McGregor, which provided a very interesting insight of the state of the war. And this at a time when the battle for Bakhmut, the Russian offensive in Bakhmut, was still underway. But anyway, Michael Vlachos has made what I think is perhaps the single most interesting comparison of this war with another war, the war between the north of the United States, the northern states of the United States, and the southern states, the American Civil War of the 1860s. And Vlachos has made some very interesting comparisons. He said that, as is the case with this conflict, there are aspects of it that have a quality of civil war. And I think this is true. Bear in mind that Ukraine and Russia are culturally very close and were for more than 300 years part of one country. He also makes the point that the Civil War, or this war, the American Civil War, pitched a poorer region, the southern states, which became the Confederacy, against a much richer region, the northern states, which are double the South's population. And he makes the point that this is also true of this conflict, that Ukraine has perhaps a third or even less of Russia's population, and that Russia is a much richer state, far more economically and industrially and technologically developed. He also talks about the fact that the southern states during the Civil War received political and some logistical and military support from some of the European powers, notably Great Britain, which, however, was, by the way, careful to stay out of the American Civil War itself. And this parallels the way in which the Western powers have been supporting Ukraine. And last but not least, he makes the point that despite the fact that the southern states were much weaker than the north, than the industrialized and more populous and richer north, the southern states pursued a policy of continuous attack against the northern states in the hope that some sudden victory would either cause a collapse of morale and political discipline in the north, or might induce the South's European allies to come to its rescue, and that this parallels very closely the policy that Ukraine has been following, the military policy that Ukraine has been following over the course of this war. And in both cases, Michael Vlachos says that in strict military terms, this is an erroneous policy driven by politics and to some extent by ideology, that it would have made better sense for the South during the American Civil War to go on the defensive rather than expend its energy and resources in offensives against the North. And he says that it's the same with Ukraine today, that Ukraine's constant practice of launching offensives, of going on the attack, is expending its strength and draining its resources in exactly the same way. And perhaps most controversially of all, Michael Vlachos suggests that though on a much shortened time scale, the cycle that we saw in the American Civil War will repeat itself over the course of this Civil War. That the South eventually collapsed because it exhausted itself. It no longer had the men and machines necessary to continue the war, and above all, its military and political leaders began to lose faith in victory, as its people did, and eventually that led to the capitulation at Appomattox. And Vlachos suggests that Ukraine is on the same trajectory, though at an accelerated rate. He says that the losses that Ukraine is suffering are on the same sort of scale. They haven't yet reached the levels that the Confederacy absorbed before it collapsed, but they're starting to approach them. And he also says that with every passing day, with the offensive failing to make progress, with more losses incurred, with more damage to Ukrainian territory being done, even those people in Ukraine who up to now have been passionately supportive of the war, are increasingly having doubts that victory is achievable and will come, and that they're starting increasingly to question the prospect of this, and that this ultimately would lead to a further collapse of morale, which will spiral and cause the entire military system in Ukraine to collapse downwards. And I have to say that this seems to me a completely plausible way of approaching things. I think, and I said this previously, if there is a Russian offensive over the next few weeks, if the Russians do capture Kupiansk, which Ukraine captured last year in its successful Kharkiv offensive, if they move on and capture other places like Izium and Balakleya and other places like that, then the effect on morale in Ukraine will be dire. And as I've already said, there will be a major operational military crisis. And of course, Ukraine's Western sponsors will at that point also start to have doubts about the prospects of victory. So it seems to me that that is the stage where we are in. A lot of talk over the last few weeks, 2 weeks or so, of a Ukrainian breakthrough, but it's clear that it's not materialized. If you look at the maps, Ukraine is where it was, and apparently a military conference between General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian Armed Forces commander, and General Mark Milley of the United States, with General Karali of NATO and Admiral Radakin of Britain also in attendance, and attempts to reboot the offensive. This was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and an attempted reboot of the offensive, which has so far failed. No sign of it achieving any degree of success, no sign of any Ukrainian breakthrough. As I said, Ukraine stuck and continuing to absorb enormous losses. And into the middle of all of this, who should turn up but the Secretary of State of the United States, Tony Blinken. Now this, of course, in an unannounced visit, but of course that's nothing unusual in itself. Generally speaking, Western visitors to Kiev don't tell us in advance that they are coming. And of course, given that they're visiting a city, the capital city of a country at war, it's perhaps unsurprising that they're particularly reticent about the fact that they're on their way. I ought to say that it is highly likely that the Russians not only know about these visits in advance, but have been told about them by Western governments. Western governments will want assurances from the Russians that there won't be any attacks on Kiev or on buildings in Kiev where these visitors are likely to be. And I am sure, I'm confident that on every occasion the Russians have given those assurances, because they don't want the international crisis. If any top Western official were to be caught up in an air raid and were to be wounded or killed. But anyway, the fact is, always silence preceding these visits. And in this particular case, the fact that we had no advance notice that Secretary of State Blinken was on his way is unsurprising and is consistent with what has happened before. But what is not consistent is the fact that he is in Kiev apparently for 2 days, or is going to be in Kiev for 2 days, and is staying the night there. And that begs the question, why? Now, in the briefings that we got on the way, while Blinken was on the way, we were assured, and this is what's appeared all over the American media today, that Blinken went to Kiev to reassure the Ukrainians that the United States stands fully beside them, that American support for Ukraine is not faltering. And he did come with some material tokens of this. Another $170 million of military aid, which of course includes depleted uranium shells for the M1 Abrams tanks that will presumably be appearing on the front lines in some weeks' time. There's only about 10 of them apparently in Europe at the moment, but anyway, there we are. And he did provide more money for other things, the civilian economy and things like that. But these announcements could have been made from the United States itself. The Pentagon itself released a further rather thin update of the amount of weapons it was providing just a few days ago. It's difficult to see why this latest package, the one which Blinken brought with him, could not have been announced simultaneously with that one. And of course, the economic and other aid really isn't particularly eye-catching and isn't anything new either. So why did Blinken actually go to Kiev? Well, I'm going to suggest that it is again connected with the offensive. I am going to suggest that it was all planned and probably agreed at around the time when General Milley and General Zaluzhny were having their meeting in Lvov, and that perhaps the meeting was planned with the intention of Blinken going to Kiev in the hope, or perhaps the anticipation that a change of tactics, new tactics by the Ukrainians, a renewed effort on the southern front lines would have produced a breakthrough which was real, not essentially fictitious, like the breakthrough we've been hearing and reading about over the last 2 weeks or so. Of course, that breakthrough has not materialized, and Blinken has gone anyway. And he's in Kiev for 2 days, and that suggests that he's going to have very substantial discussions indeed with senior Ukrainian officials, with President Zelensky, with Foreign Minister Kuleba, and others as well. And interestingly enough, there are reports that alongside Blinken, there is someone else currently present in Kiev, and that is the Prime Minister of Denmark. Denmark, European Union country, NATO member state, fervid supporter of Ukraine, part of the F-16 fighter coalition, a country that has been unstinting up to now in its support for Ukraine. Now, if the Danish Prime Minister really is in Kiev alongside Blinken, then I can't help but feel that this is not chance or coincidence, that the two have timed their visits so that they're there at the same time, and that suggests to me that they're coming to Kiev with the same message, and they want the Ukrainians to understand that this is a united Western position, not just one from the United States or from Europe. And what would that united Western position be? Well, Blinken did not provide much in the way of additional military support. The economic support that he provided is the same as always. He's made some bold statements about Ukraine and its fight and its success on the battlefields, the fact that it's supposed to be advancing. but that, of course, has been said many times. I can't help but think that in private it's different, and that in reality, the reason Blinken is there is because a realization has now been reached in Washington, that a military breakthrough by Ukraine is not going to happen, and that the offensive is indeed on the brink of failure, just as President Putin of Russia has said. And for the United States, that presents many problems. It presents logistical problems because there is now, it seems, a dearth of weapon systems that the United States can send to Ukraine. The European Union is bravely talking about doubling its production of shells, but it's been talking about doing that for months and hasn't delivered. And its current production is anyway only around 4,000 shells, 155 millimeter shells a month. So doubling that would only produce enough shells for one day's use by Ukraine. So that doesn't sound very impressive. Belgium has opted out of the fighter jet coalition. It says its F-16s are too old. They're not really in a position to perform anything on the battlefields. There's only 8 Ukrainian pilots currently training to fly the F-16s. Attempts to cobble together more tanks are being made. Ukraine is about to receive 20 more Leopard 1s and 20 more refurbished Leopard 2s, but that's probably only covering existing losses and is not increasing Ukraine's striking power. The United States is still short of shells for itself. And of course, the United States has an election next year. The President of the United States is still planning, apparently, to seek re-election. He has to persuade the American people either that Ukraine is victorious in the war, which is now looking to be realistic, beyond reach, or at least he's got to bring this situation in Ukraine finally under some sort of control, so that it's not dominating the media anymore, and that the American people don't face a situation, perhaps in the spring or summer, where it looks as if an ally of the United States, supported against the feelings of many Americans with hundreds of billions of dollars of US assistance, is now once more going down to defeat, just a few years after something very similar happened in Afghanistan. So I can't help think that Secretary Blinken's purpose in coming to Kiev is to tell the Ukrainians that with the offensive not succeeding, it's no longer practical to try to impose conditions on the Russians of the kind that Zelensky's so-called peace plan envisages, effectively the total capitulation of Russia. There will have to be some kind of negotiation with the Russians for some kind of diplomatic outcome. And I think that is part of the message that Secretary Blinken intends to convey. But I think there's also going to be a secondary message as well, which is that, of course, the United States has to find someone to pin responsibility upon for the failure of the offensive. And the defense minister, Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, has been sacked. He's been shuffled out. He's been, accused of presiding over a corrupt situation in his ministry, even though it's been carefully said that he's not corrupt himself. It'd be far too embarrassing if it turned out that he was, by the way. So he's been given the comfortable sinecure post of ambassador to London. But of course, that's probably not enough. One has to find other people to blame as well. And there have been articles in the Financial Times, a long article in the Financial Times, saying that Ukraine is ignoring Western advice, American advice, to drop its attacks with light infantry forces, piecemeal attacks by small groups of light infantry. It fails to create the critical mass needed to achieve a breakthrough. Nonetheless, Ukraine is not paying any attention to this advice. It's continuing to launch attacks in this sort of way. There's been a similar article, by the way, about this in the Wall Street Journal in parallel with Blinken's visit. It's saying that Blinken's visit is happening in the context of some acrimony between the United States and Ukraine about the battlefield tactics that are being used by Ukraine in this offensive. And then, of course, there's also the fact that Ukraine willfully refuses to follow American advice and strip all of its front lines of troops and concentrate overwhelming force in one sector, the Rabotino, Verbovoye, Orechov sector, to launch this great breakthrough to Tokmak and beyond Tokmak to Melitopol. And of course, the person who is behind the scenes, clearly being blamed for all of this, is General Zaluzhny, the overall commander of Ukraine's armed forces. Now, that is particularly unfortunate for him, since I think it is fairly well known that he was opposed to the entire idea of an offensive in the first place. But that probably, given that it was the United States that insisted that there should be an offensive, is something that the Americans are more likely to hold against him than in his favor. So, perhaps we could start to see demands that perhaps General Zaluzhny also retire from the scene. And coming back to a recent interview that appeared in The Guardian, I do wonder whether the fact that so much prominence is now being given to General Tarnavsky, who is the commander, apparently the operational commander of Ukrainian forces in the Orechov, Rabotino, Verbovoye section, might suggest that even as General Zaluzhny exits, General Tarnavsky might be in for a promotion. That's just a guess. We'll see. But anyway, I wonder whether that is also part of what Secretary Blinken might be saying over the course of his trip to Kiev. Now, Blinken has been consistently throughout this war a hardliner, and he's taken very strong positions on behalf of the United States, and he's done the same in interviews he's given to journalists like David Ignatius in the United States. So the Ukrainians have probably come to see him as a friend. And of course, if he's coming to Kiev with information that the United States is going to start looking for some way to exit the war, even if that means some kind of discussion with the Russians, well, it will come as a particular shock, perhaps coming from him, but of course it will press home to them, since it is coming from him, that this is now the final decision of the United States government. Well, that's how I have to say it looks to me at the moment. It was a very interesting and very suggestive interview that Sergei Narishkin, who is the head of Russia's Secret Intelligence Service, its equivalent of the CIA, has just given. in which he disclosed that the CIA and the SVR, the agency, the spying agency that he heads, have been in sporadic contact. And he said that the United States had underestimated Russian power and Russian resolve. And he also said that once Russia has won the war, what Russia will need to do is to take steps to recalibrate the international security environment, essentially to prevent wars like this happening again. And I have to say that all of that did read to me just a little bit like Narishkin was conveying in a very discreet way some points about what the United States would have to talk to the Russians about, assuming that talks were to take place at all. But will they take place? And this is where we have the problem. I think that the United States, it's already signaled that if it can get a frozen conflict in Ukraine, that it will settle for that. We've heard many discussions over the last few weeks about the United States having discussions with Ukraine about security guarantees. I'm sure, by the way, that this is a further topic that will have been brought up by Blinken over the course of his visit to Kiev. It is increasingly clear to me that the United States is very unwilling to spell out what those security guarantees are going to be, unless and until the current hostilities in Ukraine are brought to an end. It seems oblivious to the fact that the United States is talking about security guarantees to Ukraine, freezing out the Russians from any such talks, actually incentivizes the Russians to continue hostilities. But anyway, given that the United States is apparently looking to freeze the conflict and to agree security guarantees with Ukraine, perhaps with the eventual prospect of admitting what's left of Ukraine into NATO, well, if that's the plan, if that is what the United States is currently thinking about, then Narishkin is essentially saying it won't fly. There are, I'm afraid, very, very good reasons for thinking precisely that. And we've had some really extraordinary articles now appearing. There was a very disturbing article on Sky News by John Siracusa. He talks about the way in which the negotiations, or lack of understanding of negotiations, is freezing up any real thinking about how to exit the war in Washington. And John Siracusa has made this article for Sky News. He says that Ukrainian soldiers, the title is Ukrainian soldiers are sitting ducks amid their army's mounting death toll, and it could still get a lot worse as US diplomacy goes missing when it's needed most. And then he goes on to say that the news along the Potomac, that's to say in Washington, is not good. I talked to old friends in Washington the other day to take a sounding of the political elite's views regarding the end game in Ukraine. I learned a few things. They unanimously agreed the hawks had wrested complete control over the foreign policy establishment, and that the war in Ukraine had taken a backseat to preparations for the coming conflict with China. So those who say, forget Ukraine, forget Russia, focus on China instead, they are winning the day. But look at what is coming. Moscow is seen more as a nuisance while Kiev is clearly a distraction. When asked about the political humanitarian obligation to staunch the heavy loss of life in Ukraine, possibly 2,000 souls per week, they tell me there's nothing much more Washington can or should do about it, and that it's pretty much up to Kiev to call time. As far as they are concerned, the Biden administration has no responsibility for the outbreak of the war. Russian President Putin is raw evil, and the Ukrainian armed forces are on their own. In any case, any diplomatic initiative to end the war would have to come from somewhere else. Washington isn't interested, whatever the casualties. Now, I don't truthfully believe that this can be the case. I cannot believe that the United States, that the administration is prepared to sit quietly and allow Ukraine to collapse next year without at least making some effort to prevent that by perhaps freezing the conflict. But what these comments of Syracusa are telling us is that within this constant battle that is going on within the Washington bureaucracy, it is the anti-China hardliners who are now winning out. They're saying, look, if this war won't end, if Ukraine won't negotiate, if the Biden administration is not able to find a way to extricate the United States out of this war, then so be it. It's up to Kiev. They're on their own. They can just collapse and lose. Our primary focus, our main concern, is China. No willingness, therefore, obviously, to negotiate with the Russians about the really serious issues, about European security, about Russian security, about the general situation in Europe. No willingness, in other words, to talk about the sort of things that Naryshkin is talking about. And if that is the case, then it's difficult to see how any negotiations can get past first base, because in that kind of environment, it looks as if the anti-China hawks prefer a collapse in Ukraine to one in which the United States negotiates about the general security situation in Europe and makes concessions to Russia. President Putin is raw evil after all. And Syracusa goes on to say that in these discussions he had with his acquaintances, they said to him that the threat of the encroachment of NATO on Russia's borders, which could be used as a decapitation strike against the Kremlin's leadership as part of a first strike, or used to compromise Russia's ability to counterstrike in response to that first strike, that's all brushed off as a figment of Putin's overheated imagination, which is another way of saying that the United States still refuses in any shape or form to discuss any of that. And the reason, again, it's not difficult to work out why. If the United States makes those kind of concessions, the kind of concessions that the Russians would be demanding over the general security situation in Europe, these same people in Washington are worried that that would result in the Chinese making similar demands about the general security situation in the Pacific and over Taiwan, and that is something, obviously, that they will oppose at all costs. And we have another article, and I should make it clear, by the way, that I'm getting all of these articles. They've been sent to me, and those invaluable links that Jeff Roberts, the historian, circulates to lots of people. But anyway, we've had another article, this time in antiwar.com, from Ted Snyder, who is another commentator, regular columnist on US foreign policy and history, and he's also a frequent contributor to Responsible Statecraft and the American Conservative. He's actually a very fine reporter altogether and commentator altogether. And he says that despite the fact that the offensive is failing, as he puts it, there is a depressing lack of imagination and diplomacy regarding a plan B. Anatole Lieven has described how former French President Sarkozy has been denounced and vilified for suggesting a diplomatic plan B. Stian Jensen, Chief of Staff for NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, apologized under outraged pressure for suggesting that compromised diplomatic solution might be an option for a plan B. The New York Times ran an article on September 1st with a headline, "As Ukraine's fight grinds on, talk of negotiations becomes nearly taboo," reporting that some analysts say that there is a closing down of public discussion on options for Ukraine just at a moment when imaginative diplomacy is most needed, and that those who do discuss it face criticism and abuse. And this is why we are trapped where we are. I think, as I said before, that it is inconceivable that the United States is simply going to sit on its hands and allow Ukraine to collapse next year. They're probably sensing that they're running out of military options, but at the same time, they're not prepared to negotiate with the Russians on serious matters. They are prepared to talk to the Russians about freezing the conflict along the existing battle lines, but about nothing else. And if the Russians reject that, well, going back to what John Siracusa says, well, in that case, Kiev, to all intents and purposes, is on its own. And if the war continues and Ukraine is defeated, well, so be it. The United States will be rid of Ukraine. Joe Biden might go down to electoral defeat, but the United States will not have made any concessions to the Russians about the security situation in Europe, which might open up Chinese demands for similar concessions in the Pacific. And the United States will, from that moment on, be in a position to focus on China instead. And in the meantime, if President Biden goes down to political defeat, electoral defeat next year, well, he's only the President of the United States. He will no doubt be replaced by someone else. And Donald Trump, if it is indeed him, will probably be so hedged around by pressure and criticism, and he's pretty anti-Chinese anyway, that it really won't matter. Well, I have to say, I think that if this is the scenario that we're looking at, and everything points to it, then we're in a very, very bleak situation indeed. I would say that these people that John Siracusa is talking about seriously underestimate the impact in Europe if events turn out as they say, if there is a military defeat in Ukraine, if Ukraine collapses in the way that John Vlachos is talking about. I think that in Germany, a lot of people will feel that Germany has made extraordinary sacrifices. It has, in effect, mortgaged away its economic future in order to try to save a country that the United States is walking away from. And I think in Germany the impact will be bad. And I think in Eastern Europe also it will be bad. Already there's criticisms of policy starting to spread in East European states, in Bulgaria, in Slovakia, where there are elections in a few weeks, and even in Poland. There's an interesting article by Mike Krupa. You can find it on Larry Johnson's blog, Sonar21, in which Mike Krupa references certain commentaries made by more realist people in Poland, who are also now saying, openly saying, that Poland has overinvested in Ukraine. And it's much more going to cause much more damage to the US's overall security position, not just in Europe, but even with respect to China, if instead of a diplomatic outcome in the conflict in Ukraine, this conflict ends with a straightforward defeat. But this is where we are. Real concessions, substantive concessions, are impossible. People like Blinken himself, the neocon group of which he is ultimately a part, people like Victoria Nuland and others like them, they are not really able to even contemplate substantive concessions to Russia, which they have a visceral dislike of. And the anti-China hardliners, they are keen for the United States to move away from Ukraine. They're prepared to consider a frozen conflict there as the optimal outcome at the present time. But if the Russians won't buy it, and if the war goes on, and if Ukraine is defeated, well, so be it. I've never known a more sterile time in diplomacy. And if we're talking about the situation in Europe, it is every bit as bad. Nobody seems to have a plan. Nobody seems to have an idea about the way to go forward. It's interesting to see how political leaders who a year ago seemed on top of the world, people like EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, are now gradually fading from view. In France, I noticed an interesting article in The Economist talking about the battle to succeed Emmanuel Macron. He's still president, but apparently there are already people within his own entourage and within the established political parties who are trying to look for ways to take over from him. And Macron himself, perhaps in response to all of this, is already making bitter comments about the fact that the French constitution prevents him from standing for a third term. So he senses that he's a lame duck president, that he's basically lost control. And as I said, the battle to succeed him as the leader of the French establishment is now on. In Germany, Chancellor Scholz is behaving, as I said, in a most eccentric way. Supposedly, he had a fall whilst he was jogging. Can happen to anybody. He got some bruises, which is, again, something that can happen. But instead of perhaps waiting for those bruises to heal a little, he's publicized photographs of himself wearing an eye patch, looking like a piratical figure, presumably in an effort to assure the German people that he is still there. He can't apparently give himself even a few days off for his injuries to heal before he makes himself visible in this way again. And unsurprisingly, that's inviting comment and even some really astonishing rumours about the true cause of these injuries, which, as I said, it's Chancellor Scholz's odd behaviour which have brought about. Now, I can't again help but think that this is a further sign of the intense stress that Olaf Scholz and probably other members of his government are under. The German economy is weakening. There's great increasing criticism. There's talk that Germany is becoming the sick man of Europe. Eurozone growth has essentially stalled. There's high inflation, and the AfD is rising. And of course, further east, he's looking at a crisis in Ukraine. So he doesn't come up with any plan. He has no real idea what to do, but he does tweet pictures of himself wearing an eye patch, apparently. As I said, I have never known at any time a more sterile and bankrupt era in diplomacy and in foreign policy, such as this one. Even during the most intractable period of the war in Vietnam, there were negotiations and discussions, often indirectly conducted between the two sides, with people in the United States coming up with ideas and solutions about how the war could be brought to an end. The same was true of Afghanistan as well. In fact, you have to go back to German policy in the last years of the Second World War to find a diplomacy which has collapsed as entirely. And there were, of course, extraordinary reasons for that, which do not apply in the current case. But it seems that every impulse to negotiate is coming to nothing. Even as Secretary Blinken turns up in Kiev, probably tells the Ukrainians that there's bad news, they're not going to get their lost territories back. The United States is going to be talking to the Russians about freezing the conflict. They're not going to get much more in the way of military support. And by the way, and just incidentally, it might also be a good idea for them to reshuffle their generals. Anyway, that's my take on the situation at the moment. We'll see over the next couple of months, weeks, whether I'm right. But in the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day, to remind you again that you can find our programs on our other platforms, Locals and Rumble, and before long, X, the former Twitter as well. And you can also support our work by going to Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also go to our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.